Yo, hey everyone, this is LRJ, making sure that we're recording. I'm streaming live, so this is going to be a recording from that stream. Today I'm going to be talking about, I have a double feature actually. It's on Is Meat Really That Bad? And it's another video from NPR that we'll watch right after this. It's on Eating Less Meat Helps the Environment. So you have a double feature. So I wonder if this first video is going to talk about the same issues that we're going to talk about in the second video. This one's probably in regards to how meat affects our biological functions, and given that humans are omnivores and we very seldom make meat, how it's impacted our overall health. So I don't know much about biology. I'm not a biologist by any means. I'm a chemical engineer. So let's see what our dear friend has to say.
Food is arguably the best thing about being alive. No other bodily pleasure is enjoyed multiple times every day and never gets old. It's an expression of culture. Our parents love
the video
and a
freezing?
means of celebration or comfort.
Why is our video freezing?
That's why it hits a special nerve when we're told we should change what and how we eat to fight rapid climate change. One of the most delicious foods, meat, gets the worst press. It doesn't help that the topic is really hard to properly research yourself, and that debates get emotional quickly. But clearly, science can give us an answer.
How do you guys feel about this? So my biggest take on this always is that overall, it's not that the consumption of beef itself is bad for our planet, for our society, like from an individual standpoint, but it is bad, to society as a whole. For a number of reasons, mainly that huge increases in production of cattle for a number of reasons, has caused an increase in the greenhouse due to the releases of greenhouse gases, like cows produce through their farts, methane. In addition to the large amounts of land and water needed to cultivate, to take care of cattle. In addition, it's not just because the two countries here on the west that eat a lot of meat, beef, that's what I mean, beef, red meat in general, they're America and Brazil, right? And you can even see in Brazil, the Amazon forest is being deforested due to the need to have more land in order to raise more cattle. We're now starting to see on the eastern side of the world that there's this westernization taking place where countries like India and China are eating more chicken, so more poultry in general, and more red meat. So, countries that are in the West also may have to somewhat meet the demands of growing Eastern civilization as well, right? Larger countries like India and China, right? People are starting to become part of like a Western like middle class, right? And so taste increase, quality of life increases.
Well, it's complicated. Let's take a look at 3 climate arguments against meat that are used a lot and see what happens.
Wait, hold on. This is exactly what I was talking about, right? Diet, just not the caption. Diet, local, land use, right? Land use is really big with cows. You'll see some.
1. Does our diet really play that big a role in climate change? Feeding billions of people is impossible without causing emissions. Even if some...
Oh, I totally misunderstood. This video is definitely not about how meat affects our bodies. This is about climate change. So,
we have zero-carbon tractors, refrigerators and cookers running on renewable energy, and electric trucks to move our food. There are still unavoidable emissions. Rice emits methane. We cut down forests to make room for pastures and crops. And we emit nitrous oxide when we use fertilizers and manure. Worldwide food production is responsible.
So I talked about this in my previous video. The one problem with methane is that it's a greenhouse gas. I mean, what greenhouse gases do are, what usually happens to heat is that it hits the earth and then it reflects back off, or that heat dissipates. However, the problem is greenhouse gases trap the heat in, which has been causing increases in average temperatures uh, on a global scale, right? So um, the entrapment of greenhouse gases has caused the global warming.
Responsible for about 26% of all human-made greenhouse gas emissions, which is unfortunate since food is not optional. While 26% doesn't sound that bad, it means that even if we extinguished all other sources of emissions today, the emissions from food alone would still use up our entire carbon budget by 2100. So no matter how we twist and turn it, food is a real driver of climate change. Still, emissions from different food items vary a lot. How do things look when we compare their footprints separately? Food's climate impact is most often based on life cycle assessments, an analysis that looks at all the emissions of a product throughout its existence, from production to transportation, packaging, use, and waste management. In the most detailed meta-analysis of life cycle assessments to date, beef emissions stand out at the top. On average, a kilogram of beef emits 71 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. Lamb is also high at 40 kilograms. Pork emits 12, and poultry 10 kilograms.
Isn't like a plug for lamb. Anyone else love lamb? My favorite thing I lived in Philly, like curry mutton, or just like a lamb shank, like at a Greek restaurant. Oh my goodness, incredible.
At the bottom, we have lots of plant-based foods. Potatoes, for example, emit around 150 times less than beef. The most important aspect of food isn't weight, though, it's nutrient density. A kilogram of beef would keep you alive much longer than a kilogram of potatoes. So how does the ranking change if we compare emissions per calorie or protein? Not much.
Don't sleep on potatoes. You shouldn't, completely overload on potatoes. They're actually, superfood. They have lots of nutrients in them. So, even though the nutrient density might not be as high, potatoes are still goated.
Protein is still the most costly for the environment, and beef and lamb are also outliers in emissions per calorie. But is this fair? After all, not all beef is the same. There are all sorts of ways to rear cattle, from pure grass-fed to factory farming. The worst beef comes in at 105 kilograms of emissions per 100 grams of protein, the best at only 9, a tenfold difference. In contrast, most other foods, especially plant-based, have a much narrower spectrum. Still, the best beef is worse than the worst plant. Okay, but this seems promising. Can we buy the right beef and lower our emissions? Maybe by buying locally produced beef to minimise our footprint? 2. Does buying local food actually matter? Let's stick with beef, since it's such an outlier. By buying locally...
How do you guys feel about buying local food? I watched this documentary once on chicken, right? Just like some of the atrocities that are occurring with the poultry industry. And, we have a pretty huge reliance on chicken, so not much we can do there. However, it was interesting to note that, organic chicken, yes, the chicken is bred in a more natural manner, but it's hard to say that it's been making that much of a difference. I know there have been a lot of people that have been going towards like even free range, for example. It makes a small difference, but it's not that much. So I'm curious to see what video will say
to
next.
avoid emissions from transportation and packaging. But it turns out these only account for 0.5 to 2% of beef's total emissions. Actually, transport and packaging combined are only about 11% of all food emissions. Nearly all food transport emissions are produced over the last few miles, the regional travel on the road supplying the markets and shops in your area. International food transport happens mostly on freight ships, which are insanely efficient. For example, shipping 1 kilogram of avocados from South America to Europe generates about 0.3 kilograms of CO2 equivalents in transport emissions and around 2.5 kilograms overall, while 1 kilogram of beef from your local butcher will come in at 18 kilograms in CO2 equivalents at least. So even when shipped great distances, emissions from almost all plant-based foods cause lower emissions than locally produced animal products. Okay, so if transport doesn't play a big role, what causes the vast amounts of emissions from beef then? By far the largest share of beef emissions consists of methane released directly by the animals. While CO2 hangs around for centuries, methane only stays
This is what I was
in the
talking
atmosphere for
about.
decades. But in these short periods, it is very powerful. All in all, methane has already caused 23 to 40% of human-made.
So actually, they say that that methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So you can have less of it in the air, right? That would have the same effect as a larger mass of carbon dioxide that would be in the atmosphere.
So far, there's controversy about how bad this is exactly, and we don't want to dive in too deep here. But the way things stand, any kinds of extra emissions are not great. Still, all cows burp and fart to similar degrees. What explains the spectrum of beef emissions? There are a couple of things. It makes a difference if the beef comes from a dairy herd or one dedicated to beef production. 44% of the world's beef comes from dairy cows, sharing its footprint with dairy products. Dairy cows tend to get higher quality feed, which makes them grow faster and emit less methane. Geography also plays a role because it determines which farming methods are possible. The worst factor by far is the destruction of forests for farmland. Not only does this release the CO2...
I just mentioned this. It's crazy how I mention these things and talk about. I guess that must mean that I somewhat know what I'm talking about, right? I don't admit to know everything, but I know some things. And yes, most of a lot of the damage that's being done to the planet from a climate perspective is due to the fact that we're deforesting in order to have enough land to take care of cattle.
Was bound in the flora, it sets free carbon that was stored in the soil and destroys its ability to store it in the future. This aspect accounts for much of the range of emissions in beef. The worst emitters are farms burning down rainforest for farmland, especially in Brazil. There is a sinister truth hidden here. The more animals suffer, the better they are in terms of climate change because they are way more efficient. They use less land and their food is brought right to them, and so they grow faster and don't expend energy on things like walking. Cattle in a factory farm that never get to roam pastures can sometimes be less destructive for the climate than cattle grazing peacefully on a formerly lush piece of rainforest. But isn't it a bit out of touch with reality to demonize cows so much? Some of the land these animals are grazing on isn't suitable for crops anyway. By grazing on pastures, they can turn things we can't digest into food. Isn't farming animals just a smart way to make the best use of unused resources? 3. Don't cows mainly use land that we can't use for agriculture or other things? About half of the world's ice and desert-free land is used for agriculture, an area the size of the entire Americas plus China. Half of all agriculturally used land is dedicated to animals. Most of it is grassland, 65% of which cannot be converted to cropland. So pasturing animals is actually a very efficient way to use those areas since we can't grow human food there anyway. There are a couple of catches here though. While the idea of cows turning useless grass into steak is nice, it is part of a marketing lie. Even though it is so massive, pastureland alone can't support the ruminants living on it. Globally, grazing systems sustain only 13% of beef production. So if we were to switch to 100% grass-fed, we'd simply have to eat much less beef. In the US, beef production would crash by some 70% if it were to exclusively rely on grass. The only way to sustain our high demand for meat is by growing crops and feeding them to our cattle. And we haven't even talked about chicken and pigs, which exclusively eat feed crops. Because of this feed demand, less than half of the world's cereals are used directly as human food. 41% is fed to animals. The same is true for soy.
That's crazy.
There's a lot of
So
talk about
41% of that grain is going to animals. Interesting. I wonder how much of that's wasted.
Deforestation for soy production, which makes us think of soy milk and tofu. But only 19% of global soy production goes towards products for humans. About 77% is used to feed animals. Besides, land without food crops isn't automatically ecologically useless. A beef-free diet would free up around 2 billion hectares. A vegan diet would free up around 3 billion hectares of land. We could use this land to grow forests or restore wild grasslands, basically anything that could suck carbon out of the atmosphere. If we spared 3 billion hectares of land, it could remove about 800 billion tons of CO2 from the air over 100 years. By comparison, we emit about 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalents per year at the moment. Okay, to summarise, food is a huge driver of emissions. Meat, but especially beef, is the worst food in terms of emissions. Buying locally does not have a big impact on food emissions compared to the type of food you're consuming.
This is exactly what I mentioned, right? There's not much difference between what you would get organically and I guess it would be normal. It's definitely a matter of like making completely different choices, right? As opposed to saying, grass-fed or organic beef as opposed to what you'd normally get. So it's like, okay, do I eat chicken versus beef instead?
When it comes to beef, cattle that are grass-fed can sometimes even be counterproductive because they just need much more land. Even if you find the most environmentally friendly beef in the world, your burger still comes with a significantly higher carbon footprint than a veggie patty. You can decide for yourself what you want to do with this information. In fact, you are always only one decision away from making a change. You could start learning a new skill or...
Yeah, what do you guys think about that? Yeah, it's definitely like, as I said, a matter of making a choice in terms of, eating things that are completely different, right? So I hope this video gives you a better understanding of the impact, that cows and cattle farming have on the world that we live in today. So, feel free to leave a comment. Let me know how you feel about this, and we can continue talking about it in the Discord. All right, I'll talk to you all later.